Well, I met him in about 3 waves of meeting. And the first, I was quite young. A family friend, Alan Watts, this popular philosopher, he'd travel around with his back of his car full of things that he was promoting, sometimes his own books, but also things of friends. And he came by my parents' house, and he had this new record that was by his son-in-law, Joel Andrews, who was a harpist, accompanying this San Francisco poet. So we put it on, and my parents were interested in Zen Buddhism and a few other things, and so right away we just loved this silliness and the wit and this unlikely harp, melodramatic or harp arpeggios, but we liked it, so we bought a copy, and Alan Watts helped a lot of people that way, getting things out into the world. And then he also said this man, the poet, had been a professor in San Francisco in a mythology course, and one of his assignments was to all the students collectively to create a 2-day-long ritual, and he would grade them on that. And I just thought, gee, this is really interesting. So James entered my mind indirectly that first time. And then it was years later when I moved to San Francisco, and I thought I'd heard that he'd died. And I was kind of sad, but I thought I would have liked to meet him. And then I went to the Gay Film Festival, which was 6 blocks from my home, and up onto the podium clambered this very lively old man who turned out to be James Broughton. So I was so happy to learn that he wasn't dead. And when that performance was over, I caught him at the exit door, and we just spoke a little bit, and I met this very nice young man, Joel Singer, who was his partner. And that might have been it. But this wonderful woman, Ruth Costello, was the custodian of Alan Watts's archives and his Society of Comparative Philosophy. And after he died and the painter Varda died, she went to live on the houseboat that they had made famous in Sausalito. And she had these wonderful salons. And I met Lama Govinda there, and his wife Ligotami, and the Austrian physicist Friedrich Capra, and this poetry, I don't know what to call her exactly, but she made Dylan Thomas famous and many others. And it was just fascinating to go there. And about the 6th time I went, there were James and Joel. And I was so happy. And this time we had a real conversation. And so that, to me, was the beginning. You know, and then, not much later than that, they moved to a house just 2 blocks from mine, near Liberty Street. And then it was so easy and natural to trade back and forth, come to me for dinner, go to them for lunch. And it was just delightful, you know, and James was so civilized and light and funny and intelligent. So it was really wonderful. Everything was always in order, but it wasn't fussy. It was just in order. And the objects they had were interesting objects. And it just felt very comfortable. And almost always there was either food or drink involved. Joel, who is perhaps the best cook I've ever known, but he would take the whole day to make a lunch. And he'd bake, after getting all the ingredients together, he would bake a loaf that fit that menu. And the result to me was the meal put us on clouds in a way. And we hardly ever actually talked about the meal. And every once in a while I would say, oops, you know, it's really sublime. But somehow the food elevated the conversation. And sometimes it was very literary, sometimes it was very erudite, but mostly it was easy, witty. And I think this is what civilization can be like as a day-to-day thing. You know, civilization is such a big word. But if we think of civilization in a daily sense of living it, I think James was a wonderful exemplar of how you might taste civilization in a daily way. I think he strengthened something that I call the magical. I found beauty very appealing. And when I began to have spiritual experiences, the divine or spirit or whatever appeared to me most often in some form of beauty. And I began to feel that if an atmosphere was magical, this was kind of the highest form of beauty. And with James' playfulness, I just found that he also knew about the magical. He also participated in the magical. And so he and a few others have all made me feel not alone in being so happy in the magical. When I've traveled in America, we get there and we kind of look around as we go. But with James, it was a journey in some way. It was more than just getting to point B. Oh, a new adventure. And so when James and Joel came down to LA, we had arranged that I would show them some of what I knew about Southern California. And we went to the Ranch House Restaurant, which is a famous Southern California restaurant. And the owner, Alan Hooker, met us for lunch, and he ended up treating us for lunch. And he would order one good wine after another. And he was secretly gay or bisexual, and so he never admitted that, but he knew all the same people that James and Joel did in the cooking world and elsewhere. So it was a very expansive, long lunch on just all the different cooks and chefs in California, and Alan was in heaven. He kept bringing out more fine wines for us to drink. And so then the next day, we drove most of the way up the coast. And what I enjoyed most was as we went by the Santa Maria turnoff, James would say, "Oh, I wonder if so-and-so is still teaching drama at Hancock College." Or then we got to Monterey, "I wonder if so-and-so is still chef at this restaurant." And I saw there was a whole secret map of gay California that he and a few others knew from 10, 20, 40 years ago, when gayness had to be very secret, and but that there was this map, which James, of course, knew very well. So I enjoyed that very much. There's a word that isn't very common nowadays, and I wish it were. It's fae in the traditional meaning of light and almost elusive, and people most frequently refer to Irish people or Celtic people as having a fae presence. And to the extent James was of Irish extraction, that was really there. And he was Irish in certain ways. The charm was Irish, and this fae and the light humor weren't heavily accented Irish, but it was very Irish in its nature. To me, an older man, when I met him, I remember in thinking about this interview, I wanted a word that was better than twinkle, because there often was something like a twinkle in his eyes, but that expression is too banal. Somehow there's just something a little bit alive, not exactly mischievous, but just knowing that any moment we're going to cook up some good new thing. So his eyes were very alive in that way. And his eyebrows were very interesting, very individual hairs going different ways, very, very appealing, I thought. I think James really loved pleasures, not all pleasures, but again, I think he loved almost best human conversation, and certainly fine food. And the fact that Joel was such a good cook was a very sweet part of their relationship. And they almost always invited guests for meals. In reading over things over the decades that he did, I see he really persisted with his poetry, corresponding with other poets, seeing how to arrange for the publication of a book. Would so-and-so be open to this project? Would so-and-so be open to that project? So I'm not sure that was weird in the sense of charm and glee, but there was a persevering about poetry and also about film, but I experienced him mostly as a poet. And I just saw the dedication of month after month, always coming back to this and seeing what's happened with that poet, or are they getting divorced, or how does that affect everyone else? So he really was persevering about his poetry. There are two large categories for me. There are many others, but the ones I cherish most are what I call really the immortal ones, that just in 100 years will be wonderful to read, like the Garden of Eden. They're just so fine, and I've been reading them for over 20 years now, and I still find them just right, just very satisfying. And then there's a large body, which I don't enjoy that much, but which I call doggerel. But James obviously just enjoyed writing doggerel. He had a wonderful time writing these flim-flam rhymes and things. And I realized his enjoyment was really so great that that's enough. And in one of his last poems, he says, "I plash in my poetry puddle and hope to keep God amused." In between those, there are a lot about sexual liberation, but it's really about liberation of the personality, liberation of the spirit. And there are a lot of wonderful ones there too. The Gardener of Eden. I am the old dreamer who never sleeps. I am timekeeper of the timeless dance. I preserve the long rhythms of the earth and fertilize the rounds of desire. In my evergreen arboretum, I raise flowering hopes for the world. I plant seeds of perennial affection and wait for their passionate bloom. Would you welcome that sight if you saw it? Revalue the view you have lost? Could you wake to the innocent morning and follow the risks of your heart? Every day I grow a dream in my garden where the beds are laid out for love. When will you come to embrace it and join in the joy of the dance? Almost everyone I show that to loves it. A few times, somehow in springtime, I start feeling a little bit wacky. And almost every springtime, I write one or two wacky poems. And they look very similar to James Broughton poems. So they allow deliberately crazy rhymes and improbably short or improbably long lines and changes in level. I'm guessing that his most serious approach was before I met him. That when the beat poets and others were looking at Zen and other things, and when several of them, Allen Ginsberg and others, went to India for a while, and Gary Snyder, I think, went to South Asia, I'm guessing that as young men, their ardency was probably strongest then in spiritual exploration. By the time I'd come to know him, he seemed to have settled into a kind of Taoism with lovingly eclectic bits of others all around. Whenever James collected wonderful quotes, and I also love to collect quotes that I like from different sources. And so I think he was quite willing to enjoy a good thing in any philosophy or religion that he found, although not very friendly to institutional religions. And in Taoism, there's often a thing about, Alan Watts put it like, be like a ping pong ball floating down the stream. That you just go on and nothing damages you unless someone tries to damage the ping pong ball. But I think James was very like that, and he was mostly in good humor as his ping pong ball went down the stream. I remember once he had a slight overdose of my spirituality, and he said very gently to someone else, "Oh, Michael, he's always so cosmic." He took something from established religion. He took ritual, and he liked ritual. But it was usually making his own ritual, or a group making their own rituals. And I don't do that myself, but I very much admire when it's done seriously, and I think he did do it seriously. Only very fleetingly, like at the start of a poetry reading, he might sometimes do something of a ritual character. Never in any more serious, longer sense. Parties are almost the essence for James. One of my favorite things when the year he turned 75, and they always traveled a good deal. And so thanks to Joel whispering ahead, there was a birthday party everywhere they went that year. So James had 11 birthday parties, and he just loved it. And I remember at a very humble poetry reading over in Berkeley, there were about 40 East Bay poets gathered, and somebody brought out a few bottles of $2 champagne, and James just said, "Oh, champagne!" He really loved parties. I did a homage to James as a pleasure garden party, which was one of his best movies. And I made my living room filled with green branches and a couple of 4 or 5 statues, because where he filmed it in London was an abandoned park where there were all these statues overgrown with shrubbery. And so my living room was made into the pleasure garden. But also I rigged up a huge bed and canopy over the front door in reference to his other very popular film, The Bed. And anyone who came into the party had to pass through the bed. I wasn't being very subtle. And we had a wonderful time. And James, that time only James read poetry. And then we showed the film. And people were in such a sea of happiness that evening. I could almost just see that they just floated in happiness. It was just a really wonderful time. And one time, one of the wonderful radical fairies, who was a great dancer, was in town, and he was a Scorpio also. So we called it the Three Scorpios birthday party. And at that party, James read some poetry, and I read some poetry, and this fellow just danced, and he was I don't go for ballet that much, but his were American Indian dancings, and he would do them almost all naked with a few feathers on him. And it was just very powerful, and everyone just stopped while he did that. And then we had served a dinner, but for the salad course, we had promised the goddess arising from the Miscloon salad mix. And my grandmother had made an old Egyptian trunk, which is over there. And Madeleine, an artist, wanted to do this. And so she was naked. We put her in the trunk. Then we covered her with this very high-quality green salad mix of 60 different greens without a single lettuce. And covered her and then closed the chest. And then people came back in the house. And Doug Gosling raised the chest, and then gradually the goddess rose out of the neck, out of the Miscloon. And I think that's the thing people remember most years later, of naked Madeleine in a salad. Well, I think back when those started, there were a lot of young people who wanted something different, but they didn't know what. And so just the spontaneity of having 100 men or 400 men coming together for 3 or 4 days generated a lot of creativity. But there were a few older men there, and James was perfect because he was completely friendly, completely open. But if he read a poem, people noticed, oh, they liked it. So it gave more substance to this very new thing. So I think James and maybe 4 or 5 other older men were very important just in helping to give form. And so many people enjoyed these gatherings so much, but also learned so much about themselves. It became a real, at its most difficult, an intense Gestalt session, but at its best, permission to really be happy and be sexual. And he was just always there. He told me about them. He said, California Men's Gathering and the fairies, you should go to some of these gatherings. You'd meet people you like there. And he was right. Historically, I'm not sure that I can say enough about the Radical Fairies, but I went to my first one called Blossom of Bone, thanks to his, encouraging me to do so. And I experienced just a degree of freedom I hadn't known before. And yet, in my life, I'd already experienced a great deal of freedom. It just was a wonderful environment, and people were just creating things. And water had to be piped in from some distance. So as not to overuse the plastic piping, the washing and showering areas were near the kitchen. And I was so excited. I went in to get my morning coffee and porridge, and there were 6 naked men in the showers, hopping around and soaping each other off in parts public and private, and singing, "Let's do the soapy samba." They were so free and so happy, and all of us voyeurs were inspired also. Just so it was an incredibly fertile mix. And then again, for James and others to come in and just offer the knowledge that you can be 60 years old and still alive in an interior way, that it was very important. And to be, I think with many young people, there's the urge just to express. And so any expression is fine. And a lot of it's pretty dumb. But for them, the lesson is still, we need to express rather than suppress. But James offered the next step. You can also be intelligent while you hop around for joy. For lovers at sunrise, at cockcrow the sun cackles, at cocklight the cocks arise. Love in the morning rouses the day. Watch skies blush brighter as the kick of uncover disperses inertia of the night. The eyebrows of dawn raise no rosier sight than renewed exercise of desire. In the fold of arms and the flight of thighs, lovers are the daily cure for life. It was shocking to me. I was at a film evening of several of James's films, and when it came to devotions, I was liking it. You know, one male couple after another were doing gentle, sweet, nice things with each other, to each other, and it was very sweet. And while I enjoyed it personally, I also saw right away that it was socially useful because this sort of thing wasn't shown. And then there are a couple of sexual things that grossed me out a little at the moment, but I survived, and I think they do perk up the film. A toe being greased up to go into a butthole. We all remember different parts. Well, I think partly for budget and technical limitations, none of them are quite as fine as they could be. You know, say if you'd had a 15% bigger budget. My own favorite is, I think it's his longest film, The Pleasure Garden. I think The Bed is probably his most important film because there are about 15 Bay Area characters in it. Alan Watts again, and the painter Varda, and the dancer Anna Halprin, and a bunch more of Bay Area characters. And it was just the idea of having a fancy bed out in the wilderness. What kinds of things could get your imagination going, in what ways? Well, I think of the Beatles' influence in America and the spread of marijuana and LSD and hopes and all those things that came at that time. So it was a very fine expression at that time. I think in The Bed, it shows great happiness in being free. All the people in the bed are being very free. The naked young men and women are cavorting, chasing each other in a very enjoyable way, and all the older people are having a very good time. They're being free. So I think the simplest thing is just to be free. And so we could create a constellation of phrases of Joseph Campbell saying, "Follow your bliss," and the later James saying, "Follow your own weird," that they're all in the same area. And then there's a very short film made with his son when the son was, 4 years old, bouncing a red ball around. But it is so innocent. The innocence of the boy is there, and the simplicity of the ball bouncing is just very satisfying. If it had been a 20-minute film, no. But so to me that was perfect. And many of the others, for me, are obscure. And James called them personal films. And I think, if you stick to that, it's fine. I have my diary writings, which are only for me. But I guess if I want to show something to the world, I want it to be more comprehensible than I find most of his films. So I think it's wonderful in the 50s and 60s to have gotten together the energy and the money to make them. That was very difficult to do, and yet he managed to do it. I have read about people who are famous, and some of them are very self-promoting. There's an American logic for fame. I think now that he isn't here, we would like him to be better known. But on that film evening in Los Angeles, my friends were so enthusiastic. They were completely new to James and his work, and most of them were straight. But they were so enthusiastic afterwards, and my friend Clifford said, "Look, this auditorium of 200 was almost full. You're going to be famous soon. You're going to be a big star." And James shuddered. He said he didn't want that at all, that what he liked to create was intimacy, a kind of a warm, sweet intimacy. And you couldn't do that in a football field. It had to be a small scale. So he wasn't interested in big fame, because without creating the intimacy, the rest was really not worth much. And I thought, oh, that's interesting self-knowledge. There seemed to be a very elaborate etiquette of mutual praise. And with me at my occasionally cynical distance, I thought, this is part of the game, and that even the smallest turf has people who struggle to be kingmakers on that turf. So there was kind of an elaborate friendliness. My guess is that he was more friendly with more poets earlier than I knew him. But I just don't really know. Well, in my own 20s and 30s, I was attracted to women and men, differently. Most of his heterosexual life was before I knew him. And I think our human bodies are equipped for everything. And it's a question of what gets stimulated, what gets encouraged, what gets suppressed. Just like the famous cook Alice Waters says that if there's a certain age, up to 7, I think, when certain taste buds and other things are open to learning, and if you can get children to try all the range of subtle tastes, then they'll have a rich gustatory life. But if you don't, it may be sugar and salt and vinegar and fat. And so I think it's the same with sexuality. I think most of James's friends in later years were 100% gay or mostly gay. And I remember one young fellow was quite shocked about how someone had just gotten married or was starting an affair with a woman, and said this to James. And James said in this very benign way, "Oh, he's just filling out his mandala," which seemed a very genial response. But the young fellow thought, okay. I thought his approaching death was really wonderful. There are about 6 poems in his last collection, from the Senex crib, and I don't know anywhere else in literature that someone approaches the idea of approaching death with such humor, mocking any self-importance, some hopes of divinity, just a wonderful mix, and in my experience, completely original. And when I meet people who are a little too serious about death, I sometimes dig out 2 or 3 of these poems and read them to them. I think basically he had absorbed enough of spirituality, either from the different philosophies he was exposed to, or LSD or whatever, that that he did have a sense of continuity, that there wasn't really an end. And so I think one worries a lot less if you know that. And I wasn't there during the last week or so of his life, which is, but I think that he was, that he approached it fairly wisely. Old Scorpio on Oahu. Don't worry about it. If you are melting, that's the way it goes. Especially if you are an ice water sign. I love to wade the warm sea, love to feel my feet turn fluid. If I dissolve neatly, what more is there to ask? No longer at any tiptoe, I can still relish the extra in the ordinary, can still take hold of the fire with my watery hands. Yeah. James was one of the most conscious and deliberate users of language. I think since Alan Watts keeps coming in, that Alan Watts was perhaps the most verbally brilliant in speaking language. Just a wonderful flow that was just always articulate and satisfying. James enjoyed putting little unexpected breaks in the rhythm of his speech and especially of his poetry. So he'd seek out other meanings of words and then use them as opposites. So it was really a hobby of his to find more words which could be turned to his special purposes. And I don't know anyone else like that. Nabokov is famous for wordplay. Vikram Seth By the Golden Gate has some very unusual uses of words. But James really made it a marker of his poetry, to feel very free to get unlikely word combinations and then squeeze them and make them work and do an unexpected job.